Hi, and welcome to Lecture 3. In this lecture, we'll discuss functions and methods, their definitions, how do you call them, what and how do they return. We'll also talk about this interesting concept of default args in Ruby. We'll talk about how to make methods more expressive, and what is a splat. So usually, when we talk about functions and methods in other languages, a function is something that's written outside of a class, and a method is something that belongs to a class. Now in Ruby, every function or method has at least one class it belongs to. Although you won't always see it written inside a class, every function or method in Ruby belongs to a class. Because of this, I'm not going to talk about functions. From now on, we'll refer even to functions as methods. So, let's talk methods. Methods can have parentheses, but they are completely optional, both when defining a method and when calling a method. Now, if you feel that using the parentheses makes it more clear to you how the method is written, sure, go ahead and use the parentheses, but there is no need to do so. So let's take, for example, a method called simple. There are no parens when defining it. There are no parens when calling it. No parens at all. Now, you could use parens to call it if you want to, but you don't have to. The method simple1, we're using parentheses over here to define it, but we're not using parentheses to call it. And that's perfectly legal. Methods also, there's no need to declare the type of parameters. So 1 and 2 don't have a declaration of a type. It's not an int 1 and 2, a long, or anything else. It's just 1 and 2. And whatever you pass there, if you decide to pass two strings into a method called add, that's fine as well, because strings also have a way of adding each other. You could also return whatever you want. So the method add doesn't tell you what it returns. It could return an integer, it could return a string, or you could have two different paths inside the method where one returns an integer and another one returns a string, and that's perfectly legal. The return keyword is optional in Ruby. Now, so if you are not saying what you're going to return, how does it know what to return? Well, that's simple. Because in Ruby everything is evaluated, the last executed line returned in the method is going to return the value. So if it's a comment, that's not executed line, that's just a comment, but anything else just gets evaluated, and that value that gets evaluated gets returned. Methods could be very expressive in Ruby. You could have methods that end with a question mark, and these are called predicate methods, and usually these return Boolean values. So for example, you have a method that says can divide by a certain number. Can you divide this by a certain number? So the method might return false if the number is 0, and it's interesting to look at the number, which is an integer. If it's an integer, it has a method called 0 with a question mark. So the integer itself in Ruby has a method called 0, which is a predicate. And we're using the return statement here to be able to bail out of a method earlier than the last executed line. So return false if a number is 0, because we don't want to be dividing by 0. Otherwise true, which means return true. Even though we're not saying return, that's the implication of what's happening here. You could also have a method that ends with an exclamation. And what this usually signals is some kind of a dangerous side effect, maybe in-place replacement or something like that. We'll get into examples of this particular one later when we talk about strings. Default arguments. Methods can have default arguments. So maybe you want to provide a certain value that if no value is passed in, that value will be used. So for example, we have a factorial method which does not use default arguments. A regular factorial method, which by the way, it's interesting, it's written as just a one-liner in Ruby. So if n equals 0, then return 1. Otherwise, return n times the factorial of n minus 1, which recursively calls this method. Again, notice no return statements. It just knows what to do and it just works. Now, but maybe sometimes you want to have a default in your method. So for example, in this case, we have an n, which by default is 5. So if you call factorial and you pass it the 5, which is this first method, that returns 120. But maybe you want to call the method factorial of default and not pass anything, and that will automatically plug in the value of 5 and still return 120. Splat. This is an interesting concept. It almost looks like a pointer, like a C pointer, but it's not. It's similar to how var args, variable arguments, works in, say, Java. So you have a bunch of parameters that you want to pass, but you don't know how many, or you don't really care how many. You want all the parameters to be treated as one parameter, and all those parameters become one big array inside the method. And the interesting part about Ruby, about how this is used in Ruby, is that this could even apply to a middle parameter, not just the last parameter in the method. So in this case, we have one param, another param, and we have a bunch of parameters in the middle. How many? I don't know. So in this case, it happens to be 3 parameters, 7, 32, and -4. And we take a max. We want to find out the max of those parameters, and that's what gets returned. Now, it happens to be that what happens is all those parameters become one big array called numbers in this case, because that's what we call in the parameter to a method. And the array already has a method called max, and actually arrays have many more interesting methods, as we're going to see later. So in summary, there is no need to declare parameter type passed in or returned because Ruby is dynamic, and because it's dynamic, you don't need to tell it what parameter it is, and it makes for some very interesting use cases of how you could use methods. Unlike in other languages where you know exactly what the method is returning, and sometimes you have to bend that somehow. In Ruby, you could pass in or return really anything as long as it doesn't break what's defined inside the method. Return is optional. And how does it know what to return? Well, that's simple. The last executable line inside the method is returned. You can construct the methods with variable number of arguments, and you could also use default arguments.